Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you all so much for being here with us tonight in person. Thank you for everyone joining us on the live stream. I'm really excited to introduce these two lovely people on the bima next to me. First, I'll just say my name is Joe Naroditsky. I am the co-chair of the Tifereth Israel 10-7 Israel Task Force. And I want to just recognize a few people who helped make tonight possible. We'll have some more thank yous later, but I just want to recognize all the 10-7 Israel Task Force members and volunteers, many of which were here tonight, greeting you and making you feel warm and welcome and gently ushering you into the chapel. So thank you all. And I also want to especially thank Faith Schaefer, who is the co-chair of the 10-7 Israel Task Force. Faith was not able to be here tonight. She is suntanning in Florida right now. But she's been working relentlessly for the last 4 months on a wide range of upcoming events and opportunities for our congregation to engage with Israel. The 10-7 Israel Task Force was created to organize and mobilize the Temple's response to the many needs of our congregation after the horrific attacks on October 7th and Israel's ongoing war against Hamas. We have several events coming up in the spring. You saw one on a flyer outside that will address topics related to mental health, civil discourse, and connection to Israel, all things that our community members said they were interested in. So we've dedicated a page on the Temple website with advocacy campaigns, philanthropic opportunities, and trustworthy media sources. And we're always looking for good ideas and volunteers to make our work stronger. So if you're interested, please sign up. There are some forms outside, or you can email Amy Aquila, our clergy coordinator. So without further ado, it's my real honor to introduce the two people on the bima next to me. First, you know, or I hope you know, Rabbi Yael Dadoun, who, in addition to being our rabbi, is an ardent and active Zionist involved with many Jewish organizations to create strong ties between American Jews and Israelis, and who has met Yisrael on many of her journeys, who has helped her gain firsthand understanding of the many complexities surrounding the prospects of peace between Israel and her neighbors. And it is my great honor to introduce our guest tonight, Yisrael Klitsner, who not long ago was fighting as a reservist on the front lines in the Gaza Strip as part of an elite special forces unit. Before that, he served as Diaspora Affairs Advisor to then Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett. In this role, Yisrael actively engaged in diplomatic missions, crafted policy recommendations, and played a central role in formulating the Prime Minister's Diaspora Affairs strategy. He was raised in Jerusalem, and his commitment to service is deeply rooted, as evidenced by his service in the IDF from 2006 to 2009. And when confronted with the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, Yisrael immediately pivoted from his academic and consulting commitments to join his reserve unit in the IDF deploying to Gaza. Yisrael is married to Lori Wasser, and together they are raising 4 beautiful children. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. This is such an important conversation that I know is at the forefront of our minds for a myriad of reasons. It has not only been a great shock since October 7th of 2023 and the pain that still lingers, but it has also awakened something that perhaps was dormant within us and has caused enormous pain, but also has helped us find light in really unexpected places at times, and has strengthened us in a way that is very unique and what I hope to be very promising. I'm not going to waste any more time speaking. I will say that in addition to being our family friend, this is a really special privilege to hear Yisrael speak, not only because he's an outstanding educator, and I've learned with him, studied with him, but also he has recently he played a very special and unique role in Israel, and we're really privileged to hear his story, and thank you so much that you're here. We're so excited. I'm going to let you take it away, and thank you everybody who submitted questions. I will make sure that I will do my best, that all of the questions get answered in a way that is satisfactory, and I know that if it's not, you'll let me know, and I'm grateful for that, so thank you. Yisrael.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Yael, and thank you, Joe, for that lovely introduction, and everybody else who helped put this evening together. And thank you all for being here. It's not a given at all that people are going to go out of their homes for anything, let alone for a difficult conversation about Israel, where I will no doubt depress some people here, which I apologize about in advance. But Yael and Joe mentioned this. I was living in Pittsburgh up until about a week ago. My wife and I officially packed our bags and brought everything back. Our 4 kids were waiting for us back in Israel. What took place before that was that my wife, who is an ophthalmologist, was doing a medical fellowship at UPMC in Pittsburgh. I followed her there, and we spent about a year and 3 months. It was supposed to be a 2-year period with the potential for a third. And it ended up being cut very short because on October 7th, I woke up early in the morning to go on my usual Shabbat walk with my friends in the neighborhood of Squirrel Hill. And I wait for them on my terrace. I don't use my phone on Shabbat usually. But when they came by, they said to me, "Have you seen the news?" And I had no idea what they were talking about. And immediately by the look in their faces, I understood that this is much worse than anything they're letting on in their facial expressions. So I ran to my phone, I saw the news, was horrified. Lori, my wife, was already awake. I looked at her, and she looked at me, and we both immediately understood what is going to transpire, which is I'm going to look for the next flight out and head over to Israel because I wanted to rejoin my reserve unit and fight alongside some of my closest friends in this world, my buddies from the army. And I did that. I spent 6 weeks initially without Lori and our 4 kids. I was stationed in the West Bank for those 6 weeks, and while we were trying to figure it out, we sort of played it by ear. And then at a certain point after 6 weeks, we were told we're moving into Gaza. And at that point, I called my wife, and I told her, I think it's best if you pack up, come with the kids, and join me here in Israel. So this is where we find ourselves, in this very odd situation. I was in the middle of a degree in public policy at Carnegie Mellon, simultaneously doing some consulting work, and just put everything on hold. So did she, just to be back in Israel and do the only thing that we knew how to do, which is take part, an active role in fighting for what I would consider to be the most just war that Israel has ever fought. I wanted to share a few slides with you. First of all, that's me on the top left over there, or your top right. And it's not my first time in Gaza. Back in 2008, I took part in Operation Cast Lead. And in that operation, the initial target that we were charged with taking on, so I served in a special forces unit called Duhutavan. We specialized in door-to-door combat. Anybody see Fauda, the show? So my unit is, or Fauda, the show, is based on my unit. And we were getting ready to go into Gaza, and we were told that our job is to take over a 20-story building, one of the tallest buildings in Gaza City, that was supposed to hold around 1,000 armed terrorists, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and we were to enter door-to-door combat and, as our IDF commanders told us, clean the building. We looked at each other, my friends and I, and said, there's no way we're making it out of that mission alive. Luckily, I'm here to tell that story, which means that plan was scrapped at that time. That's back in 2008. But I remember thinking to myself, how on earth is it possible that this is what the IDF wants us to do? I mean, it's a suicide mission. And I couldn't wrap my head around it back then. But fast forward to today, in a post-October 7th reality, I fully understand exactly why the IDF had that mission in place, because they understood then what they certainly understand now, which is the only way to truly take care of the threat that is Hamas in embedding itself within civilian population is to actually exert force that is ground force that would entail many civilian casualties. And there were always these different assessments that top military brass put together. Some would say in such an eventuality, there could be upwards of 500 casualties of IDF soldiers. And that's a very, very high price for any army to pay, but more specifically for a pretty small army in the IDF in a tiny little country.
Israel,
Yeah.
why not, in that case, and forgive the perhaps crude question, but why send IDF soldiers in a hand-to-hand combat that sounds like a suicide mission and not just technologically remove a building?
So this is the IDF age-old quandary, is how to really take care of the threat in a way that is going to remove the threat, but at the same time ensure that civilians are not going to get harmed. We're seeing it in this war. It is an awful war to fight. There are many, many casualties that should not be casualties. And the only reason that they are is not because Israel is not trying, and it's not because Israel is not being surgical in its attempts. Every attempt, by the way, that Israel has in striking a building or any other military force, terror force, has a target, has a name, has a pinpointed coordinate. And that doesn't mean that there aren't civilians in that location. In fact, it almost certainly means that there is. So there's no other way. But the quandary that I was trying to put forward, and one of the things that I hope that we take that we take away from this conversation, is stepping into the shoes of Israelis and how they are feeling, but also stepping into the shoes, and these are difficult shoes to fill, of the Israeli decision maker and what him or her, what they have to think about when making these very, very difficult decisions. And one of those decisions that already we understand is complicated and difficult is, do you kick the can down the road like they did back in 2008 and say, we're not going to enter full force because we understand what that means for us, we understand what that means for them, so let's put that aside for now, as opposed to going full force. And they waited. Here we are in early 2024, after the worst massacre since the Holocaust, in a force that initially was laughed at. Hamas was considered to be this minuscule, ridiculous force that doesn't mean much, and it metastasized into something of much greater proportions, to the point where it posed a strategic threat to the state of Israel, even an existential threat to the state of Israel, given all the messages that is sending, not only to Hamas itself, but also to other foreign forces that are waiting and poaching and certainly around the corner, lurking for the right timing. Do you have another question? Or
I was going to
yeah.
say, would you share with us your recent experience, which is obviously very different? You went back to serve in the military in this really difficult time. Would you share with us some insights of your personal experience, your story, but also help us understand where is your troop, where is the IDF in this moment, morale, in terms of consciousness? How are kind of
Sure.
the regular young and reservist Israelis doing in this moment?
So I'll start with the morale question. The morale is really high. I think when individuals in general, but certainly soldiers on the front lines, when they know what their mission is, and they understand fully what they are fighting for, and just how impactful this moment in time is, then really there are no doubts, there are no questions, there is no fear that can overcome the willingness of the soldiers to go through with the mission that they are given. So on that front, morale is incredibly high, but at the same time, I think just as an example, the question about does Israel go for a deal with the hostages, or does it continue to fight? Oftentimes, you'll actually hear the soldiers on the front lines saying, we need to finish this because we know what it's going to become again afterwards. And that's not to say that they don't understand what kind of a difficult moral dilemma this is. By the way, Israel lost this war on day one. When Hamas took these hostages, they already dictated the terms of this war. And therefore, the two goals that the IDF and Israeli politicians set forth of, on the one hand, eliminating Hamas, and on the other, bringing back these hostages, they're simply not compatible.
Why don't they work together? Why are they not compatible?
Because if the IDF decides, or if the politicians decide, that they're going for a long-term ceasefire and a deal with Hamas, what that means is Hamas is going to be able to rebuild and regain their strength. They're going to gather more soldiers and train them. They're going to fortify their tunnel construction, and they're going to make it even harder for the Israelis to penetrate and to reach. And again, this is that is the reality. So if the IDF does not go through with striking at Hamas when they potentially can, which is here and now, then they let off their foot from the gas, and Hamas rebuilds. But of course, that would bring home the people that we so desperately want back home.
I understand the difficulty
Yeah.
with this decision. Can you help us understand where our politicians are in this moment, in this quandary? And is that where Israeli society is as well? And is there a divide in opinion of what the next step should look like?
It's a really good question. You know what? I think I want to hold off on that question until and I'm sorry, I'm not.
I'll write
like,
it
that's
down.
Not, yes,
I'm going to
write
hold you to it.
Write it down.
Okay.
Hold me to it. I will answer it. I will answer it to it. But I want to get to a few things that I did want to mention with regards to some historical context that I think is really important in order to truly understand why Israel is acting the way it's acting now, and what the pathway forward might be and what might entail. The humanitarian situation in Gaza, even before October 7th, was awful. We're talking about unemployment rates of upwards of around 45%. We're talking about the around 50% of the population is under the age of 18. Clean water is hard to come by. Again, before October 7th, electricity was limited to 4 to 8 hours a day, depending on the situation at that moment in time. And the dilemma has always been for the Israelis, for also on the military side, is on the one hand, of course, you want the Gazans to have a better life. And you want to ease the blockade. You want to ease the amount of humanitarian goods that are entering into the Gaza Strip. But on the other hand, there is an entity that is ruling over the Gaza Strip in Hamas, that is an actual terror organization. And the IDF knew and still knows full well where the vast majority of the goods that are making their way into Gaza end up in the hands of, as evidenced by around 500 kilometers, probably more, of tunnels that have been constructed. We're talking about tunnels that have internet connection in them, that motorcycles can drive in, that, I don't know if you've seen any of these images, but there were billions and billions and billions of dollars that were poured into this massive underground project, basically a city under a city, which I want to get to in a moment. The question is, how did the demographic situation, how did the demographic reality that I just spoke about get so dire? And this is the historical context that I wanted to provide, which is back in 2005, the father of the settlement movement, a man by the name of Ariel Sharon, the prime minister at the time, and for those who have visited Israel, the city of Ariel is named after Ariel Sharon. There are many other settlements that are, as a gesture to him, sort of named in this way or another after him. And he made a big decision. It was like a 180 flip, where he said, we're going to withdraw completely from the Gaza Strip. Up until that point, from 1994, under the Oslo Accords, Gaza and Jericho first. Yitzhak Rabin made the agreement together with Yasser Arafat, where there would be joint and partial control over certain areas of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, the newly constructed Palestinian Authority. But then in 2005, Israel decided we are pulling out. There's going to be zero presence in the Gaza Strip. And the hope is that there is going to be a new reality in the Middle East. There's going to be this tiny little swath of land that we're talking about that is highly densely populated, around 2 million people living in it, and that the next Singapore will become a reality in this area.
And I just want to say, in 2005, this was a huge ordeal.
I
mean, Israelis had such a hard. Some of these Israelis had been living in, what is now the Gaza Strip, had been living there for generations, and some of them, unfortunately, were gently and lovingly escorted out of their homes because it was so painful and difficult.
Correct.
It's like if we were uprooted out of Beechwood and said, we're now going to give Beechwood to someone else in order to pursue peace.
Totally,
which was incredible at the time.
And not to mention that they were, to begin with, incentivized by the Israeli government to move into those homes inside the Gaza Strip. So then to be torn from those homes and taken out. But the IDF left behind these greenhouses saying, you take this, Gazans, we want you to build a better life for yourselves. What ends up happening is in 2006, that is the last time that the Palestinian Authority held open elections. And during that time, Hamas takes over. In 2007, there is a bloody civil war between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. They can't come to terms over who is going to be the rightful owner of the Gaza Strip. And Hamas ends up winning this bloody civil war. For those who remember the images, gruesome, horrible images of Palestinian Authority members being thrown off of 10-story buildings, hung by cranes, awful things. That civil war, just as an aside, is still going on, still happening. The hatred is alive and well. And what ends up happening is that after that withdrawal, the reality that Israel had hoped would come ended up being the exact opposite. And the fear that Israelis always have of what ends up filling the void that, or any gap that is left open, tends to be filled by forces that were worse than what was there before. So a lot of questions today about how can October 7th happen. And I know, that's one of the things you wanted to talk about, and I really wanted to address it because I think a lot of people are scratching their heads and saying, what on earth took place here? So of course, there was a crazy failure of proportions that cannot be described of the intelligence community in Israel that has always prided itself. People are drawing the parallels between the intelligence failure in the Yom Kippur War. Prior to the Yom Kippur War, Golda then unfortunately didn't listen to Mossad that was trying to tell her that it was going to happen. Military intelligence was telling her that it was going to happen. The failure of epic proportions back then are dwarfed by the failures that we just witnessed. And it can happen for a few reasons, but mainly Israelis are talking a lot about this term koncepcja, the conception. And the conception that existed up until October 7th and has been completely shattered is, I would say, primarily twofold, two things. One, that deterrence is something that could be had with a terror organization like Hamas, and we'll get to that in a second. And the second is that by instituting a policy of carrots and sticks, you provide enough incentive for both the civilians and the rulers in order not to want to lose what they potentially have. And on the flip side, the stick is so strong that they're not going to want it. So obviously the two are tied, right? The incentive paradigm as well as the deterrent paradigm. Yahya Sinwar, who is the leader of Hamas in Gaza, he's the military leader, not the political is Ismail Haniyeh, but Yahya Sinwar is the guy who's calling the shots when it comes to military strategy and what what Hamas is going to do. And when push came to shove, he was the person who pushed the button on October 7th and said, it's go time. He's a man who sat in Israeli prison for many, many years for strangling with his bare hands other Palestinians to death just for thinking that they had anything to do with Israel and that they were potentially collaborators. And he was actually released in the Gilad Shalit agreement, getting Gilad Shalit back home and providing many terrorists.
Gilad was
allowing
also
them
held
to-
captive for 5 years.
Correct.
And in order to get him back, Israel gave 1,100 imprisoned terrorists at the times for our one Gilad Shalit.
That is correct, and Yahya Sinwar was one of those people. And the problem with this elusive term that we call deterrence, especially in the Middle East, and especially with someone like Yahya Sinwar and trying to step into, for those who've seen like CSI and all these shows about the FBI and trying to profile criminals and step into their minds, we're talking about a true lunatic. We're talking about somebody who does not think in rational ways like we do, and therefore attempting to provide or to create an analysis or some sort of formula that says, if we behave this way, that means that you will have to behave another, or vice versa. It doesn't add up. It doesn't work. It doesn't compute in the same way that it would with somebody who's thinking rationally. Anybody rational would say that prior to October 7th, Yahya Sinwar had way too much to lose as a leader of the Palestinian people in Gaza, and that his people had way too much to lose by committing that atrocity. But that didn't matter. So it is important to understand that. And then one more point here is this October 7th doesn't happen in a vacuum. When I was an IDF soldier, not a reservist, but active duty between the years of 2006 and 2009, we'd go on special operations every single night. And this happens today. Every single day, every single night. My friends, a lot of people that I know, this is what they do. The IDF does this regularly, thwarting attacks that are imminent, that are supposed to take place any second. Some at a greater magnitude, like October 7th, never really anything like this bad, but always attempts at suicide attacks, at shootings, at trying to ram people, stabbings, you name it, and it's like in cybersecurity, where in order to be successful, you have to succeed 10,000 out of 10,000 times in blocking the threat. That one time that you miss, it's game over. That is the Israeli predicament. It's not that Hamas and Islamic Jihad and all these other terror organizations that exist on and inside Israel's borders are not attempting constantly. It's that October 7th was the big one that got away. And another evidence to this, if you look at the three photos that I put over here, one is the top left is the tunnels that I mentioned. This is actually a relatively small and not high-tech tunnel. The image to the right of it is an image, for those of you who remember, sorry, your left, yeah, is an image of what was called back then the Marches of Return. These were marches where they were organized by Hamas. Hamas would tell schools, you're not holding school today. we are going to provide buses for anybody who wants, and we're going to bring you all to the border, and you are going to charge at the fence and return where? To your, right? The return is not, we're not even talking about the occupation. We're not talking about 1967. We're talking about returns to their homes that once were prior to 1948 in places like Jaffa, in places like Ramla, in places like Lod. These are Israel proper and not under dispute. Those were the marches of return. And at the time, I remember discussing this with, I used to lead delegations of members of Congress that would come to Israel. And they would come with some pretty harsh questions about how is it and why is it that Israel is sniping at these innocent civilians that all they want to do is protest against the blockade. And the IDF would have to explain, and I would have to explain something very difficult because a picture cannot encapsulate this. But that is that Hamas is actually embedding themselves inside these tens of thousands of civilians that are on the border fence and very, very close. So we now know what the outcome of tens of thousands looks like charging the fence. But back then, it was like, well, why are you doing that? And just one more thing about this is they were actually lobbing grenades from within those civilians, as well as setting land IEDs on the border fence so that the patrol of the IDF would explode on it. It was never an easy thing for Israel to target, never an easy war for Israel to fight. And that is exactly Hamas's strategy and their tactics that they employ, and that's what makes it so difficult. One last thing is, of course, you know that there are layers to the threats. The Iron Dome that the only reason Israel had to build this miraculous technology is because what other country in the world is living in a situation where pretty much on a daily basis there are rockets shot at civilians indiscriminately? It's a mind-boggling reality to think about. I think people are sort of numb to it today because they say, oh, there's Iron Dome, what's the problem? It's crazy to me that the Iron Dome even had to be built, right? That is the crazy part of this story. Then Hamas started digging tunnels and attack tunnels, and the IDF not only had a fence above the ground, but had to build and dig a really deep fence underground to stop from penetrating into Israeli towns and kibbutzim. Yeah, you were going to ask something.
Just to your point, it's so funny. In like 2014, somebody asked me about my parents' house in Ashdod, which means they have about 2 minutes to run into a bomb shelter when rockets are fired. And I said, oh, my parents' home is getting renovated. And they said, oh, the kitchen, the bathroom? I said, oh, no, they're getting a bomb shelter in their apartment. And I didn't, because they used to have to run to the basement. My parents are elderly, so I'm glad this was installed. But it is a part of our life in Israel. I mean, this is, where the nearest bomb shelter is every day, which is something crazy. And since October 7th, kids haven't even gone back to school in regular schedules because they have to make sure that the children can have accommodated bomb shelters. Yeah. Schools are built under bomb shelters now. I mean, it's just such a different, I have to be honest, sometimes I don't even think about it when I go to, it's part of the life. That's just part of the life.
I was just looking at the news right before coming to this room, and I saw that Israel was hit by a barrage of 30 rockets from Hezbollah, from up north. We'll talk about them in a few minutes, but they hit an area of Meron. I don't know, those of you who know it, this is like central Israel, where like there's no place really that is safe, and it brings up a lot of questions, but I did want to mention a few things about the regional politics aspect of it. Do you want to talk about something else first?
Yes, one thing,
Sure.
because in our very difficult conversations lately, you and I, we've talked about what we've unearthed with UNRWA lately, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, and how that Hamas infiltrated UNRWA, all this money to basically indoctrinate children, be part of the education system, and promote terrorism. This is not money that people are donating to Palestinians, and it's going to their freedom. It's going to promote terrorism.
It's actually way worse than that. There are at least 12 that we know about, UNRWA employees, Palestinian UNRWA local employees that took an active role in the
10/7
massacre.
attacks.
Yep.
So can you tell us about that? Some of the images that I'm seeing are really terrible, and when you hear Palestinian children get interviewed, they say horrific things, and the horrible things they say, you can hear is so scripted, it's so embedded. They're clearly parroting something that I don't even know if they can grasp what they're saying. And it's very sad to see. Can you talk about a little bit about that and how that affected 10/7? And then also part B, you shared some things with me. You know, one of the things I asked you was, you know, how did it, right? How did 10/7 happen? How did we fail? And how in the last few years are they able to build tunnels that fit entire trucks in them? And we just totally missed it, and on such a horrific level. And these terrorists came into Israel, you know, many of them were completely high on these drugs and did these horrific atrocities. How did we get just what seems like a total 180? Although you're arguing it's not a 180 because Israel is constantly deflecting these incidences, but how was 10/7 so lethal in the way that it was?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll start with UNRWA. UNRWA, you know what, I'll say something general that I think is important to say, and this is my personal view. I'm sure many people will disagree, agree, I don't know. I believe that one, like myself, should be able to be sympathetic to both Israelis and Palestinians at the same time, and that the two do not have to collide. I used to volunteer for an organization that would drive Gazans from the border of Gaza into Israeli hospitals and back for chemotherapy, making sure that they don't get bankrupt by these exuberant cab rides that they had to take until that point. And now there's this whole network of Israelis that volunteer. And it's I think a lot of people are trying to do their part in minimizing the anger, you know, these basic differences that sometimes are simply not necessary. And I agree with you that the indoctrination, that the education element of this is so central. UNRWA, it has always been a bit of a question mark for Israeli decision makers, because on the one hand, they understood that nobody else wants to do this work. There's nobody else to do it, right? The Hamas is certainly not going to take care of the educational needs. The other organizations are not able to provide in the way that UNRWA is. So in Hebrew we say b'makom she'ein ish heya ish, right? Wherever there isn't a person, you be that person. On the other hand, there were no illusions about what UNRWA is and what UNRWA isn't. What UNRWA is an organization that is, in fact, perpetuating Palestinian victimhood, that is, in fact, perpetuating this status of being a refugee, when there really shouldn't be a reason for this generations upon generations later. Looking into the future, this could, again, metastasize into something much greater than what we know today, and we already see it as a pretty significant problem. The question about education and how to actually get to the core of the problem, which is how do you educate people against hate? And my question is, should it and could it be Israel's problem to solve? I think the answer is probably not. I don't think they do have the capacity, and I don't think that they should have the capacity. So it's on both levels. But yeah, it was heart-wrenching, but did not come as a surprise to any Israelis that there were UNRWA members. Everybody was like, yeah, of course there were UNRWA members who took an active role in the massacre of October 7th. Hello, like that's what we've been screaming for all these years, that this is who we're dealing with. I think there needs to be a complete reimagining and reconfiguring of what it means to take responsibility for a massive population that is ailing, that is actually dealing with the same humanitarian situation, only much, much worse in the post-October 7th era. That's to your first question. Your second question, remind me, was, it was about the lethality. Is that a word? No. About how lethal it was. When I used to lead these delegations, like I mentioned, we used to speak about these doomsday scenarios, and under worst case scenario, we never got to this. It was discussed, for example, and the IDF discusses this all the time. Horrible scenarios in which, for example, Hezbollah penetrates up north and takes over some of the moshavim and kibbutzim, the villages and towns that are right along the border, and occupies them for a certain amount of time, commits a massacre, awful things, knows that threat exists, did not believe that Hamas was capable of this, and also, the sheer, again, the magnitude, over 3,000 Hamas terrorists armed to the teeth, coming in droves on these Toyota. I see these white Toyotas in my dreams. It's a crazy thing, and to think, right? We always want to think that we're able to protect ourselves, and that Israelis know how to protect themselves. But at that point, when you're stormed by that type of force, even myself, as a highly trained soldier, holding a rifle, that's like me throwing a pebble at them. That means nothing. This kind of force is massive. And the only way to actually deal with it is with a massive prepared army that is actually ready for this kind of threat, which clearly we were not. So I think that's a little lens into it.
And they did their homework. We were in a very weakened spot domestically.
Yeah.
Israel was very weakened and was having its own domestic issues with its own government, which is a whole nother level of complexities.
I agree. They knew, and I promised that we will talk about Israeli politics, but I wanted to first...
Let's go to the geopolitical.
Yeah.
Yep, go ahead. Yep.
A bit about the geopolitics, and I think it is, I know people are thinking, do we need to hear about Iran again, and the evil axis, and the nuclear threat? If you're asking me, the answer is yes. Because every time I hear these stories, every time I heard them in the past, and I was a part of it, I lived it, meaning I had to explain these things. And I saw the faces that were in front of me sort of like nodding and thinking, oh, yeah, in the world of theory, sure, that makes sense what you just said, that Iran is evil and that there are scary things out there, but really that is so foreign to me and so outlandish that it means very little in practicality. I want to claim otherwise and try to make a case for that. So starting by what you're seeing here are two leaders of the axes, right? So there's MBS on the one hand and the Ayatollahs on the other. There has been a long-standing battle. I mentioned before the civil war between Hamas and Palestinian Authority. There's another civil war of sorts that has been going on for centuries, and that is between Sunni Islam and Shiite Islam. Or roughly 80% of the world's Muslims are Sunni, around 20% are Shiite. Predominantly, the Shiites are living in the areas of Iran, as well as some in Iraq. There's a presence a smaller presence in Lebanon. But since the revolution in 1979, Iran has employed, by their radical theology, has employed a strategy of looking for countries that are on the brink of collapse and wiggling their way into controlling those countries. So mostly they're looking for countries that are mired in civil war themselves. Look no further than Yemen, than Lebanon, than Iraq, than Syria. All of these countries have something very similar in common, and that is that their infighting was pretty prevalent at the time when Iran began their process of leaving their imprint. And slowly yet surely, Iran has built something very sophisticated that reaches pretty far. I'll skip this one, but you know what? I want to go to right here. You can see the map of the Middle East that shows you Iran's land corridor that it is sophisticatedly created that spans all the way from Iran through Iraq, through Syria, and reaches Lebanon. And you see puny little Israel that is waiting there in the corner. And what this essentially means, to take all this weird theory that is technically 30,000 feet, which really isn't, and start explaining where I mentioned before the analogy of cyber warfare, right? That you need 10,000 times to be correct. Iran is playing the long game. What they do is they've been sending for years. They're funding around 50% of the funds that Hamas is using are coming directly from Iran. Near 100% of the funds of Palestinian Islamic Jihad are funded by Iran as well. Lebanon it has Hezbollah. Hezbollah, just to give you a sense of the force that we're talking about here and why it dwarfs the threat coming from Hamas, they have a force or a rocket capability that reaches, it's around 100 to 150,000 rockets and missiles that many of them can hit with exact precision anywhere in Israel. We're talking about an army the size of most countries, greater than the size of most countries in Europe. So Iran has built this single-handedly, and what they have made many of the countries in the region think about and try to grapple with is how to deal with not Iran, but what Iran's tentacles ultimately become. So when I was working for Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, he used to use the imagery of the octopus. I don't know if you've heard this, but he said Iran is like the brain of the octopus. It's the center of the body. And then what it does is, like I said, it finds these countries that are weak. It begins a process of embedding itself in them, mainly with proxies. We're talking about forces that are militias, not necessarily their own people. They have the IRGC Quds forces whose sole purpose is to train those Shiite militias, but they're embedding themselves through them. And what ends up happening is there's this spread, and the threats emanate not from Iran itself, but from Hamas, like we just saw, and from Lebanon. And Israel is then left with the decision, we need to strike back at these forces that just struck us. But those forces are coming from somewhere. It's similar to this question about education, right? You don't get to the point where people are willing to sacrifice their lives just to kill innocent civilians out of nowhere, out of thin air. That happens out of a long process of education. How do you get to that core? Same goes for the Iranian threat and what they're posing. That becomes a really difficult question, and one that is not easy to answer. There's one more thing that I wanted to mention, which is I'm sure you've heard a little bit about the Yemen quandary and how the U.S. is getting involved in that, and we'll talk about the U.S.'s involvement as well. The U.S. is applying pressure on Israel not to necessarily bring Hezbollah and Lebanon into the fold full scale. And the reason they're doing that, which I understand where it's coming from, is they're worried about a further conflagration and a growing of this conflict to the portion and size of what would potentially become a third world war. That would bring into the fold the axis that Iran is part of, which is the China and Russia axis. And the U.S. is understandably very worried about that. On the other hand, Israel is sort of taking it on the chin right now. We just saw that they shot 30 rockets at a town in Israel. Again, under what circumstance is that okay? In what country in the world is that a normal thing for a country or government to sustain, putting their own people in harm's way because somebody woke up that morning and decided that they wanted to attack? So yeah, you wanted to?
Yeah, it continues to be perplexing to me how Israel is constantly in this quandary of difficult decisions on multiple fronts with multiple armies. I want to be mindful of time, and I really want to talk about Saudi Arabia and the relationship that Saudi Arabia was building towards right before October 7th.
Sure.
And since then, now Saudi Arabia is potentially hosting a conference to bring some sort of semblance of next steps. Can you walk us through that? What would that look like? What does, the next day look like? What does the, reversible acceptance of a Palestinian state look like moving forward? What are we looking at here realistically, and how are these perhaps unexpected, participants playing a role in this situation?
So a few years ago, the image that you see behind me is of the signing of the Abraham Accords. The reason that it was so significant back then is that up until that point of signing that document, it was the relations between Israel and what we call the moderate Sunni countries in the Middle East, mostly Gulf countries. Those relationships were actually pretty good, and they were warm, but they were beneath the surface. And nobody got to the point where they're actually saying on a diplomatic level, we're willing to take this relationship out into the open. And that has been something that Israel really, really wanted. There's a thinker, a philosopher in Israel. His name is Dr. Micha Goodman, and he speaks about this. There are two poles. On the one hand, Israel really, really wants to be accepted by the West, and on the other, it wants to be feared by its enemies. And his claim is that those two things are not compatible. In this case, what we're talking about here is something that Israel always wanted, which is to be not only accepted by the West, but also to be accepted in the region that they joined back in 1948, and even earlier than that, when there was a Jewish presence for a long time. And that acceptance has and will continue to be in question so long as Arab countries are not in agreement that they should be part of the accepted nations in the Middle East. But strategically, with regards to what I was just talking about with Iran, what this meant, at least from Israel's standpoint, but also from Saudi Arabia's standpoint, and part of the reason they're incentivized into coming into this pact, is that it strengthens this connection, this axis that is the anti-Shiite Iranian axis, the combat, the antithesis to what the Russia, China, Iran sort of line is pushing towards. And sending a clear message to Iran that the Middle East is not yours. It is not your playground, and you will not radicalize it in the way that you are trying to do. And it's not just a rhetoric message. It's not only that type of message, it's also a message of strength, of military power. There are other countries that we can speak about at great length, like Qatar and how they're playing a two-faced role, and Egypt and Jordan that have had peace with Israel and what that looks like today. And these are difficult relations to manage. There's no doubt about that. And whenever a war like this eventually comes along, and every few years, historically at least, Israel has fought these types of wars, the questions continue to arise of how are these relationships reassessed. There's instability in Egypt. Will Sisi, who's the leader there, continue to respect the peace agreement that was signed back in the 70s? Not clear. That was actually that came into question in the past. Jordan, that it constantly they have upwards of 60% of their population that identify as Palestinian. They're catering to a base as well, at least politically. You know, there's no simple answer here of how accepted Israel can become and how fast that process can be moved along. But what it is clear is that Israel will continue to attempt to reach that level of acceptance. The big elephant in the room, of course, is the Palestinian question, and the Saudis have already stated on grand stages that there is not going to be normalization with Israel without a two-state solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And I don't know how much of that is rhetoric and how much of it will actually play out in the real world of diplomacy. However, I think what they're doing is nodding at the fact that they cannot sideline the elephant in the room, that it needs to be addressed in some way. What that way and that pathway actually looks like is a huge question mark. And if you ask Israelis that question right now, they will not be happy with that question. And the reason they'll not be happy with that question is they're saying, you're talking with us about peace with Palestine. You're talking with us about potentially getting to the point where we're thinking about the day after and who's going to rule over the Gaza Strip. We're still pulling dead bodies out. We don't even have our dead bodies yet. We don't have our live bodies yet. How are we speaking about this right now? So I'm talking about that in terms of the sentiment on the street. But to add complexity to this, I want to show you another slide, which is this one right here. The public opinion on the Palestinian side, it is a depressing picture. And this relates to your question about UNRWA and about education. There's a well-known pollster, a Palestinian pollster by the name of Dr. Khalil Shikaki. He conducts polls both on the Palestinian side and the Israeli side. A lot about the two-state solution and things of the sort. And when he asked Palestinians, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, whether or not they supported October 7th, forget right now the Israeli response, retaliation, all that. That question is a separate question. The question of do you or do you not support what Hamas did on October 7th was answered as a yes, with 82% support in the West Bank. And in Gaza, where, mind you, these are civilians that are being held as human shields, 57% said yes. So still a majority given the really ridiculous situation that Hamas put them in. So it's depressing numbers. And for Israelis to hear these things and then in the same breath to hear about what about the two-state solution, it's not just a head-scratcher. It is a really, really difficult conversation to even begin to have at this moment in time.
Does it even feel realistic in that Hamas has been very open in saying they're not interested in a two-state solution? They're not interested in anything except for removing Israel from the map. So how does that play into that? How does that play into an agreement?
Of course, Hamas can't play any role in this. There's no question about that. But let's say Hamas is out of the equation. Even then, Mahmoud Abbas is well into his 80s. He's a chain smoker who's been on his deathbed, literally his deathbed, quite a bit of time, sometimes saved by Israeli hospitals. His own public opinion polls are the worst they've ever been, and they've always been horrible. We're talking about single digits and lower. The Palestinian Authority as a group, as an entity, is not accepted by Palestinians. Palestinians actually reject them. They think that they are corrupt because they have been incredibly corrupt. So I don't, again, like, that's not to say that there couldn't be some constellation in the future and that one shouldn't strive to find what that constellation looks like. But it is to say, let's at the very least, try and wrap our heads around what the Israeli decision makers have to consider when beginning to tackle these types of questions. What the Israelis on the street are thinking and feeling when somebody says to them, not even 4 months after, or 3 months or 2 months after the biggest massacre in their history, you need to think about how you fix this thing. And all that with the caveat of, I think Israelis actually are sympathetic to the Palestinian plight. And actually, there are many Israelis who understand that it isn't necessarily viable to rule over millions of Palestinians either. So I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that if somebody portrays this as, oh, it's a slam dunk, here's what you need to do, you should question that.
I appreciate you bringing it back to Israeli society, and
Yeah.
as we have written here.
Yeah.
I want to get on a plane for a moment and fly across the ocean and come back to the United States for a minute and talk about United States Jewry. I'd like to hear your perspective as a both, right? As an American Israeli, Israeli American.
I didn't mention, my parents are both American, but I was born in Israel, spent almost my entire life there.
What is our responsibility? What do we need to be doing? What do we need to be thinking about? What should we think about in our education system? What do we need to, contribute that is meaningful moving forward in a post-October 7th world?
Yeah. My hope, my dream, I woke up October 8th, depressed, of course. I think many of us were. And just really not being able to see any good way forward, any light in the near or distant future. But what provided that light immediately after were my neighbors in Pittsburgh. We're the American Jewish community that I am a part of, that I am embedded in, and it was very clear to me. They're feeling pretty much what I'm feeling. I'm feeling what they're feeling. We are in this together, and it was a really, really good feeling. There were many people who of course reached out, but also kicked into action immediately. And the second Lori and I got on a plane, the second I got on a plane and Lori was there alone with the 4 kids, there was a meal train for her every day. There were people stopping by and checking in on her. There were people who were driving the kids to their practice. And really incredible. The entire community just came together for that moment. And I think that is worth holding on to. We need to cherish the strength that we have as an empowered Jewish community, and I think we need to lean into that. There's a lot to lean into if we look for it. There's also, when I worked there, again, I'll use an analogy that Naftali Bennett, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett at the time used to use. Every diplomatic mission that would come by, he would start the talk by saying that 70% of Israelis agree on 70% of the issues. And it's only those 15% on either side, on the fringes, that are ruining it for everybody else. They're the ones who are driving the conversation, and because they're the loud, obnoxious minority that is extreme and that wants to polarize. But really, there is a large community right there in the middle that is the majority and needs to not remain silent. I was active in trying to push along the march in Washington, and I thought it was incredible. I think those are the types of efforts, but not only that, and just the solidarity that has been seen all over the place is a true testament to the strength of these relations, however fraught they are, and I know that there are a lot of issues. If we choose to always focus on what divides us as opposed to what unites us, there will always be a there. But there's so much more in the pathway of what binds us together that is worth holding on to, and I think we need to. That's what we need to fight for.
Yisrael, we can't thank you enough for coming here today and sharing both your personal story and your perspective. And I hope that not only do you travel safely back to Israel, but that you are going to help bring shalom in the region, whatever that looks like.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I say one more thing about?
Please.
So I did promise to answer the Israeli politics question, and I also just wanted to say something about Israeli resiliency that I think is important to note. In terms of Israeli politics, I believe that we have more hard times ahead. I mentioned the public opinion polls on the Palestinian side. I think if you would poll Israelis right now on some difficult questions, you'll see that there's probably more polarization, and that is one of the byproducts, yet another one, of what happens as a result of October 7th and the massacre. There were so many issues that needed to be parsed out in Israel, and that Israel was actually working on prior to October 7th. The judicial reform, religion and state, getting the ultra-Orthodox to actually join the military or do anything else, right? Sorry, I didn't mean for it to come out that way. The income inequality, cost of living. It's impossible to purchase a home in Jerusalem or anywhere else in the country. All these things that are real, these are everyday problems. And unfortunately, almost every election cycle, when push comes to shove, there is one issue that stands far above any other issue: security. And there's a reason for it. When you feel like it's not just a threat in the ether, it's not just this some potential that might happen sometime in the future, it's not this talk about, oh, there's an Iran in the world, but it actually happens, and it actually takes place on a daily basis, that means that's going to push you more than anything else to make your decisions in life. And what it also means is that you don't end up having the luxury to get to the very difficult conversations that Israel absolutely needs to have from within. And what that means is that the tendency to polarize even further, I think, is unfortunately heightened. So I don't bring grim, I don't bring, sorry, the opposite of grim, optimistic hopes for the future, but I again, I hope this helps provide a lens through which you can view some of the events that are likely to take place in Israeli politics in the near future. The other thing that I wanted to mention, which is just ending on a high note, is that I've been moved to tears, joyous tears, on many occasions since October 7th, hearing about heroic act after heroic act, people giving of themselves selflessly. Even just looking at how my sister, who is a mother of 5, living in Jerusalem, and her husband is a pretty high up commander. She kicked in, and she's representative of almost every other. And on the flip side too, there are many women who went into not just battle, but into other important positions in the IDF, and their husbands kicked in, and it became this community-wide resilient effort that allowed for a response that is not only on the military front, but on the home front, and happening in a very strong way. Sebastian Junger, who is a reporter, he's a wartime reporter and author, and wrote a few books. One of them is called Tribe, and in this book, he is in search of who has resilience, how does resilience come to be, and he brings Israel oftentimes as a prime example, and not for the reasons you would necessarily think, but mostly because Israel usually has its back against the wall and is actually fighting for something very tangible that they can actually see and feel, and that having your back against the wall actually allows a community to feel like a community and to converge inwards as a tribe in ways that are building resilience much more powerfully. When I was serving in my regular not reserve duty, but in my active duty back in 2006, from my base, I could practically see the home that I was protecting in Jerusalem. That is a very powerful thing. And I knew that I'm protecting my family. There was a terror attack that took place not too far away from my family, and I apprehended the terrorist immediately after. And that sinking, gut-wrenching feeling that I felt right after was of both pride that I was able to catch this person, and of great responsibility of this is my home. This is, if not for us, things spiral out of control, and we need to. That is having your back against the wall.
For those of you who we've been speaking in the last few weeks and months since October 7th, it's been really astonishing to me how, and not surprising, as a faithful Jew, how our Torah portions have really aligned with what's going on in the world almost perfectly. I would argue that always happens, but it's been very amplified since October 7th. This week's Torah portion is Mishpatim, meaning laws, rules, where we think about judgment, and it has one of the most famous lines in it that we all know: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Yes, friends, that comes from our text too. And there's something very difficult about an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, because we know that that's not how it works, and it's much more complicated. And what does that look like, an eye for an eye? And our Torah explores that, and of course our rabbis expound on that even further and try to figure out, what does even Steven look like, if you will, and what does winning look like, and what does peace look like? There isn't a formula that's clear from the outset. If there was, we would be signing up for it in a minute. But we can glean, and I would argue is the most important thing to glean from this is, Yisrael, what you just mentioned a few moments ago, and that is this idea of dialogue, even when we're not unified, even more so. In this Torah portion, as I'll speak about tomorrow night, when I know you'll all be here for services, we say that, that God gave Moses the 10 Commandments, and the Israelites received it in kol echad, in one voice. That is not to be confused with all of the Israelites agreed. Quite the contrary. We know they didn't agree on, it was definitely not 70%. But that was okay. They were a unified front, and they came together as a unified front. And there is nothing that has changed in our tradition in the thousands of years. We must continue to fight in a unified way, especially when we disagree, and to find ways to come together, and never, ever, ever to say, she's a Democrat, he's a Republican, he likes, he's a vegan, she's a, right? But to move away from those stereotypes, and not just with our Jewish community, but with everybody who crosses our path, and bridge commonality and not separate ourselves and not create gaps and enemies. Before we all leave, I've asked our Cantor Sibo, to join us on the bima, please, to lead us in the singing of Israel's national anthem, Hatikva. And I invite everybody to please rise if and as you are able.
Kol od balev penima, nefesh Yehudi homia, farte Mizrach kadima, ein Litzion Sophia. O loved Atikvateinu, Atikva בת שנות 2000, להיות עם חופשי בארצנו, ארץ ציון ירושלים. להיות עם חופשי בארצנו, ארץ ציון ירושלים.
I thank everyone so much for joining us tonight. I also want to say thank you so much to our current Temple President, Beth Derry, who's watching from afar. I want to thank our 10-7 Israel Task Force that has been working tirelessly to respond to the needs of this community, but also global Jewry. And to our task force co-chairs, thank you so much. And to our staff at the temple that is always coming together in these moments to make these events happen, Amy Aquila, Cindy Wilson, Jen Mendelson, and thank you, Cantor Sibo, who literally just got off a plane and came straight here from the airport. Thank you so much, Cantor. And of course, to our speaker, Yisrael, thank you. You're always welcome back in our home. Toda.